Thanks, Jeanette. Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Fisher, Director of ABAF in Queensland. And on behalf of the Australia Business Arts Foundation, welcome this evening. At ABAF, we're constantly looking to explore and embrace new challenges and opportunities that have a high impact on our cultural industries, while continuing to demonstrate our commitment to connecting the arts, business and donors across Australia. ABAF is very proud to present the Culture Label Tour and bring their unique perspective on cultural entrepreneurship to Australia. ABAF and Culture Label have a shared belief that the arts and business are better together. So we want to develop these relationships and be smart in our approach. If you'd like to join in our conversation on Twitter tonight, please use our hashtag, which is up there on the screen, #ABAFCultureLabel. And I should also mention that next week, you'll be able to access the slides from tonight's presentation on the ABAF website, abaf.org.au. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to especially thank the State Library of Queensland as host and major presenting partner for ABAF's Culture Label Tour here in Queensland. This tour is also part of ABAF's Richard Pratt Legacy Project, developing leadership in the arts and cultural sector with support from the Pratt Foundation. And I'd like to acknowledge their contribution, along with national partner, the British Council, in making this program possible. So, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Queensland Simon Cronshaw and Peter Tullin, the London-based founders of Culture Label. Simon and Peter started Culture Label back in 2007 by writing Intelligent Naivety, a book on cultural entrepreneurship and commercial income generation for the arts. Putting their money where their mouths were, they actually gave up their day jobs to start Culture Label, so it was quite a risk. CultureLabel.com is a global marketplace which features unique products and affordable art from over 500 leading cultural organisations, artists and designers, including leading international cultural brands like the V&A, the Tate and the British Museum. The website also features a unique art marketplace, which is the first to curate editions and original art from leading galleries, as well as allowing you to buy them using an interest-free loan through an innovative partnership with the Arts Council in England. So, to Simon and Peter. Simon is a technologist specialising in e-commerce strategies spanning on-site merchandising, marketing and the triggers to buy. His specialist research area is in understanding the changing nature of cultural consumption, especially concerning digital supply and demand. Simon's a bit of a .com guy, even though he mightn't like me saying that. Peter's background includes brokering sponsorship deals worth several £million between some of the biggest cultural organisations and companies in the UK for arts and business. He puts his wealth of experience into practice at Culture Label's agency, working with both commercial brands and cultural organisations. He's recently helped Google with the Google Art Project, so basically Peter is the brand guru of the partners. Simon and Peter are both regular keynote speakers on the subject of cultural entrepreneurship, cultural retail and e-commerce, and commercial income generation for the arts. On a personal note, I had the pleasure of meeting with both Simon and Peter in London last year and hearing about their exciting work firsthand, so I'm sure you'll enjoy tonight's briefing. Please join me in welcoming Simon Cronshaw and Peter Tullin.
Hi everybody, we're really delighted to be here. Very quickly, just want to say thanks to ABAF, who've been fantastic hosts. Also to the State Library, we've had great fun plotting new ideas and initiatives with them over the last couple of days. So it's been really great fun, everyone's been very welcoming. So yeah, really delighted to be here. So tonight, we thought we'd just tell you a little bit about our journey and the origins of culturelabel.com, and then move kind of swiftly into a kind of trend briefing of what we think might be interesting in this whole emerging area and the blurring of culture, technology, and entrepreneurship. Both the trends that are happening out there, which all of us as everyday consumers are kind of participating in, helping to create, but also those trends that maybe have particular kind of resonance with the cultural sector. And then I think we've got plenty of time and discussion at the end. And we've just arrived from kind of Sydney. We've had a bit of time meeting with some of the cultural organisations in Brisbane as well. And we're off to kind of Melbourne and even Tasmania. So we've seen some kind of pretty amazing things already. So it'd be great to kind of hear about what some of you guys are doing as well. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Simon.
Okay, so we started Culture Label 3 years ago, where we came from a background in art sponsorship and really looking at the ways in which culture and commerce were connecting and some of the emerging trends there. We were seeing quite a lot of cultural organisations working with corporates, but it tended to be, by and large, a few number of cultural organisations that were able to really tap into art sponsorship cash and a large number that were unable to sort of really find the right sort of commercial partnerships. Despite that, we were seeing some incredible cultural brands that were really penetrating the consumer market and really having that sort of high engagement levels with customers and with users, that real sort of passion brands where people were very strong believers in the brands of these cultural organisations. So we thought, how can we take a lot of brands direct to the marketplace and create new income streams direct to that consumer base in order to get a broad range of new income? So the three principles that we founded Culture Label on back 3 years ago. Firstly, the idea of culture and commerce better together. Now, this comes from the founding place where the debate as to whether culture and commerce should work together, can work together, is working together, it's long since over and done with. The debate has happened. Culture and commerce are working together, and now the question is how well they can work together. What are the most effective business strategies? What is the greatest sort of cultural assets? What are the ways in which we can work together in interesting, creative, intelligent ways to get the very best of business strategies and the very best cultural creation intertwined and working together for a better cultural experience and commercial income generation? The second idea is this culture meets consumers, art without walls. And that basically revolves around the idea that we're all people at the end of the day, whether we're consumers, users, audiences, whatever word you want to use. We're people with everyday lives, working in, or living in the high street, walking down the high street, going to work, having a whole range of demands and influences on our time. And one of the things we're looking at is how we can take the work in which cultural organisations are up to, whether that's content or networks or services, and find ways to seamlessly interject them into people's everyday lifestyles, rather than necessarily waiting for people to come to us. What are the ways in which we can go to them? And then the third principle is this idea of get on with doing it, the innovative business models. And time again, we hear people waiting for the public cheque to land on their doorstep or waiting for the corporate cheque to land on their doorstep. And actually now we've got a lot of research from the academic community around the very best ways in which entrepreneurial, innovative companies have been developed over the last sort of 30, 40 years, from IBM in the 80s through to creative industries in the 90s, through to the dot-com in the noughties. All these ways in which people are getting on and creating something out of nothing, how can we take the very best entrepreneurial strategies and apply them to not-for-profit cultural organisations?
I think what's kind of interesting about that final point is, having worked in the dot-com world, there's something about permission to fail, which is something we're not always amazing at in the cultural sector. Because if any entrepreneur tells you, probably even kind of Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, that it kind of started here and it went on a nice kind of easy curve to here, they're probably lying, actually. There's a word that's often used in relation to technology businesses called the pivot, and it's basic acceptance that you probably won't get it right first time and you're going to have to change and weave as you go along. But because the cost of doing these things is now so much lower, you can do these kind of beta launches, small things, or do something on the check for £2,000 rather than kind of £20,000. So a lot of the thinking is just about getting out there and kind of doing it.
Now, a lot of the things that we're talking about tonight, we've put into the book that we wrote when we first started Culture Label, which you can get for free as a download from culturelabel.com. And that goes through a lot of different strategies around some of the things we're talking around, whether it's resource allocation, staff cultures, whole range of stuff around the very best innovation.
Okay, so just quickly on in terms of our story and getting here. So Culture Label is a really simple idea. We looked at the fact that, as Simon said, a lot of these brands were kind of growing in power. In the UK, we had this thing called the Super Brand Survey. And brands like Tate and the V&A, they were up there with the Cadburys and the Vodafones of this world in terms of how consumers were starting to connect with them. 7 of the top 10 attractions in London, were kind of museums or galleries or cultural attractions of some form. 5.5 million people went to Tate Modern, 6 million to the kind of British Museum. We could see, something exciting was happening. And we likened it almost to, the way that iTunes revolutionized, the music industry and has perhaps not been so good for the record labels. It has been great for musicians from the point of view of the growth of live music. And actually, we could see there's something similar happening around the kind of live experience of culture as well. Whether that was about the blockbusters or the kind of the interesting local stories, where people were coming in big numbers to these institutions. So we thought, there's an interesting way to start taking these brands in different ways to consumers, and we fastened in on kind of retail. And we looked at the fact that, museums like the Design Museum or the Royal Academy, they were producing these amazing shops, but in the online space, perhaps there was an opportunity to do an even bigger thing in terms of aggregating some of these brands together. So we looked at it from the consumer side and thought, yeah, actually, if I'm interested in the Royal Academy or the V&A, chances are I might be interested in buying some product from Tate. So that was really the genesis of culturelabel.com. We were very fortunate, and a group of organisations like Tate and the V&A and the British Museum really got what we were trying to do. And we had 25 founding partners, which since then has grown to 650 and about 20,000 products. What's probably really important about a business, and I think it's symbolic of perhaps the way capitalism is going in some spaces, is that it is a kind of passion brand. So when we set the business up, we were very clear that it was going to be a commercial enterprise. It is a technology business, so it's very important that actually we have the right people in the team. So we, on our board, we have people like the head of mergers and acquisitions, the former head of mergers and acquisitions for Google. We have a guy who was the managing director of Waterstones, which is one of the biggest booksellers in the UK. Our head of products joined us from Selfridges. You've got me and Simon with a cultural background. It was about putting that team together that could obviously deliver the product. But in terms of how we raise the money for a business that, if it's really, really successful, obviously generates an income for cultural organisations as well, was to find money from unusual places. So we have those classic, .com angel investors. But actually, one guy put his money in because he runs a big insurance firm in the city, and he genuinely believed that actually if Culture Label was successful, 80% of the retail price is going to cultural organisations, then it generates a long-term sustainable income for those organisations. So we really often talk about the fact that there's a kind of commercial and cultural dividend that comes out of these sorts of enterprises.
And looking at, we won't dwell on this, but looking at some of the brands on site, we've got that a really good mix between the large organisations, all the UK nationals are on site, but also some interesting regional organisations. It's really a leveller, the product playing field. It really comes down to how great the product is in terms of success. So we see a whole range of organisations, different sizes, different sectors, different theatres, operas, a whole range of different organisations that can really use product as a way of extending their brand into that consumer marketplace.
I'd add to that as well, also a number of the people on the site are also artists, so right from selling the products or limited editions from the big names like the Damien Hirst or the Tracy Emmons of this world, right through to partnerships with people like the Royal College of Arts, which is about how do you identify the emerging talents and connect them with the consumer audience. So to give you a kind of quick overview, the site ranges from contemporary artists like Maggie Hamlin, who's very well known in the UK, or partnerships with people like the Warhol Foundation around some of those classic products. But as Simon said, the key thing is all of the products have a story. So you've got things like this ceramic plate here, which is from a company based in Stoke-on-Trent, which really came out of the demise of Wedgwood and their financial problems, where they really believed it was important to make the stuff in Stoke, where you've got this incredible heritage of making pottery and the story behind that, but actually partner up with hundreds of contemporary artists and designers around the world to produce an incredible range of ceramics. So product with a story, that's what we're all about at Culture Label.
And we mentioned it quite quickly, but one of the big interesting partnerships in the UK is in partnership with the Arts Council England and Creative Scotland, this idea of interest-free loans for the purchase of art. So any UK taxpayer can get a loan for up to £2,000 to buy contemporary art, originals or editions from a whole range of galleries across the country. And so we've worked with those public funders to take all of the galleries on the Own Art scheme online and provide the technology for both in-gallery to enable people to purchase that, and it really attracts a certain new demographic to collecting art, but also giving the whole process of credit checks and e-signatures through an online process, so it's a very, very easy thing to do and really opens it up to new audiences.
The BBC did a great documentary on this last year showing that it was providing this sort of financial support was allowing people to buy art that weren't buying it otherwise. In a kind of fairly simplistic way, if you can buy something like a fridge or a sofa online using things like interest-free schemes, then we should make it easy for people to do that with things like art as well.
So one of the core things for us was building a very mainstream consumer brand. So a lot of the people that we attract to the site aren't necessarily traditional sort of museum gallery visitors, don't necessarily already engage with the cultural sector, but are just after great product or great art. So one of the ways we achieve that is by going direct to the media and publications like Cosmopolitan, Grazia, and others, Vogue, FT and others, really focusing in on lifestyle media, focusing on the nationals. And for example, over Christmas, we had pretty much back-to-back coverage in a lot of the lifestyle gift guides for product, and really starting to see cultural organisations really up there with the very best of high street retail. The Royal Wedding Shop is an interesting one for us last year because we were actually...
Quite big in Britain, that.
It was a big one. But through the power of aggregation, because we had some amazing partners on site creating some amazing innovative product, we actually managed to become Google's #1 result for royal wedding souvenirs, bypassing some very big high street chains that were spending a fortune on their SEO optimization. Because we had a lot of great sites linking in, we had a lot of media coverage around it, broadcasters like CBS in the States, a lot of interest from lifestyle publications in the UK and elsewhere, it really pushed the cultural sector to the very top of the search results and generated a whole load of new income for the sector by that aggregation approach.
We won't mention names, of course, but it was ahead of people like kind of John Lewis and stuff like that, which we're very excited about. I understand kind of David Jones and Maya might be the Australian equivalents. I think just kind of going back to that, there's something really important there, because we learned a fact sort of fairly early on when we set up Culture Label, which was, you know, one of the world's biggest sellers of arts, depressingly, is IKEA. Now, whether you want to call that art or not, it's kind of our mantra in the office that we want to take this stuff to a much more of a kind of mainstream audience. And you know, the genesis of the business came out of the fact that I remember kind of being in the ICA, and there was a £200 artwork by a guy who'd won the Turner Prize that week, which is a kind of big arts prize in the UK. And it was something that should have sold for us, 10, 20 times over. But for some reason, the gallery couldn't quite connect that with that mainstream audience. And actually, the price wasn't much more than a piece of, art from IKEA. So that's really what we're trying to do. Now, this is the kind of the advert bit. We are launching the site in Australia, and we want to create a site which is about Australian cultural institutions with relevant content for when people are logging on from Australia or indeed anywhere around the world. So if you are interested in that and you're a cultural organisation, we've seen some with great products, then come and chat to us, and there's a link to obviously the site there.
Okay, so we're going to go into now the trend briefing and looking at some of the things that we think are interesting going on in the different spaces. But before we do so, just want to give a bit of context in terms of the equation that we really started to formulate in Intelligent Naivety, the book, around what we mean by cultural entrepreneurship. And really for us, it's all about the outcomes and what we get in the end by doing this kind of stuff. And for us, the idea of audience development and new commercial income streams are one and the same thing. The very best strategies result in new audiences, better cultural offers for existing audiences, and also the potential to monetize some of those relationships and create new revenue streams for organizations. The way in which we go about achieving that is through really fundamentally understanding where the consumer is at in their everyday lives, what they're doing day by day in their normal lifestyles, and then fundamentally understanding what we exist for as an organisation. What is our purpose in life? What is our objective? What do we get out of bed in the morning for? And as a result, what are the assets that we have as an organisation, both in terms of things like networks, who are we engaged with, the staff in an organisation, looking at things like the content, the collections we have, looking at the spaces we have, whole range of different assets we have as cultural organisations. How can we connect that and start to interweave that with where the consumer demand is at in order to create new opportunities to connect in new different ways and start to monetize some of those relationships? And then once we've had all the great ideas, this is where the entrepreneurial bit comes in. How can we start to create the right strategies and learn from some of the most innovative companies to actually go from idea to reality? And this is about every size of organisation. Some of the best entrepreneurial organisations are 1- 2-man bands. It isn't bigger is better. It's about how do we take some of these very creative strategies around resource allocation, innovative staff cultures, niche marketing, potential digital marketing, in order to create opportunities to really grow something out of nothing and result in that kind of commercial and cultural dividend where our users come on a seamless journey where they have opportunities to experience the very best of culture and the very best of commerce.
Okay, so In terms of kind of the trend briefing, and perhaps what's interesting if you know is we do these kind of things for both commercial organisations as well as cultural organisations. And I think that's quite important because that whole landscape around sponsorship's really kind of evolving. So we'll work with, say, a creative team from a company like Skype and actually take them into a kind of interesting cultural journey. So, for example, we took their team to Berlin, and they're a group of creative people, and actually, when they meet other creative people, kind of interesting things happen. And it's all kind of quite grassroots. So this isn't about the arts pitching their ideas to business. It's actually about people from Skype going in and meeting the music producer that might really understand the youth market, meeting the street artists, going into the studios, and actually kind of encountering culture on its own terms. And then from that, kind of interesting things happen. And it leads us to this kind of way of thinking, which is, are we about kind of making new trends? So what is it the cultural sector is doing that's really interesting that companies like Skype and Bex and others want to kind of tap into? Because it has changed massively in terms of the relevance of the cultural agenda to the business agenda, and actually what trends are happening are out there in the wider kind of consumer society that we need to have our boat in the river and be ready to catch, because we need to put ourselves outside of our organisations, as Simon mentioned earlier.
Okay, so we're going to go through a range of different areas where we're really looking at how we start to look at what's going on in the wider world. We'd like to get your ideas on this as well. So what have you noticed that would be of real sort of interest in both the cultural space and further afield in broader sort of creative and cultural territory?
So first thing, bit of a health warning. It's obviously quite hard to predict the future. The image behind us of Kodak, we're all probably pretty familiar with their woes of late, but these were the guys that invented the digital camera. And when the person walked into the boardroom saying, I've kind of invented the future, you can also understand why they might have said, we've kind of got quite a lucrative business going on there, maybe we'll just kind of push that away. The same way that, in a matter of a few years, companies like Blockbuster going under, and you've got the rise of things like kind of Netflix. Change is happening, as we know, so quickly now. The fact that it took Apple, a company we associate their great change, 8 years to get to $1 billion, and you've got kind of Groupon doing it in kind of less than 2. And then equally, this tendency to think, well, it's kind of going okay, maybe we can just kind of muddle along there, is really risky because, with the library we were talking about the fact that, in less than 5 years, the Kindle has become the dominant form in which we read the book. E-books are now outselling paperbacks. That was the kind of last milestone that they had to get past. And that's really interesting when you think in the States, any Kindle user can share a book with another Kindle user, which, and certainly in terms of how the UK measures, one of the main outputs of public libraries in terms of lending books, the kind of biggest public library in the world is kind of out there in the cloud. Now, it's not an exact comparison. You've got to buy a Kindle, you've got to buy the content, but the fact that you've then got third-party companies helping sort of me as Peter to share my book with somebody that I don't even know, these models are really being kind of challenged now, or the fact that we now go to Google to find our information, or we meet up with people through kind of Facebook. There's a whole, obviously, digital world that's starting to cannibalize and erode things that previously did within cultural organizations. So, what does that mean for us? So, one of the organizations that we worked with, and it was a really interesting one, I guess from a political point of view, was the Houses of Parliament. And actually, how do you develop a commercial strategy for an iconic World Heritage site? A building that's kind of known throughout the world. Incredibly kind of challenging thing to do, but, equally, and actually if you want to check this one out, it's one of the few reports that we've done that because of the Freedom of Information Act in the UK, the entire report's kind of online, so you just go to kind of the Parliament site. So that's kind of our words on it. Equally, you could check out the front page of the Sunday Times, which also had their view on strategy as well. Because as you can imagine, it was a hugely kind of controversial thing, this. But our approach was to say it is possible. So, in the face of adversity, for example, and the Windsor Castle fire quite a few years ago now, the Royal Collection was born. It now generates £42 million a year for the Royal Palaces. But what it's also led to is the opening up of those spaces, so the public that want to get closer to those buildings, to the objects in those buildings, to the stories, they can now do that. I'm sure obviously the Royal Wedding also helped with the figures last year as well. But a lot of it was about saying, how do we spot the gaps? So for us it was about saying, well, you've got this building. I don't know if anybody's been to kind of Leicester Square. There's a kind of an interesting tourist offer there. You've got lots of these kind of low-end sort of tourist souvenir shops. So some of the ideas around, how do you create a premium aggregated high-end kind of product range for London, and not just one associated with the House of Parliament. How do they work with other organisations, for example, like the London Transport Museum or the Museum of London? Often a lot of these ideas are about how the cultural sector comes together. So, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to now go through a whole range of slides around trends that we think are interesting. There's quite a lot that we want to talk through, so we'd encourage you not to take notes on this part, but just to start thinking through the connections and some of the ways in which these trends can interweave with each other, how we can start to create multi-layers to these trends, and how they can impact our organisations, and then all the slides will be available on the website at ABAF later.
Okay, so I think obviously we're kind of familiar with the things like the Google Art project, which had a lot of publicity, and a number of Australian institutions were involved in it. But what's becoming kind of really clear is, this is providing audiences with another alternative. You've got visitors that aren't even necessarily going to set foot within cultural organisations. I've got a message there. I'm not in the spotlight, apparently, which apparently isn't very good for filming.
Subtle.
But the message was delivered via an iPad, which shows you how much, obviously, the world is changing. So the Google Art project for me is kind of fascinating, because there are things you can do through that project which are hard to do, obviously, in reality, such as their gigapixel images that allow you to go in and scan in and view it in huge detail beyond what the human eye can see. The fact that you've got 134 institutions from around the world that are all suddenly in the same context, so you can follow trails, whether that's particular artists that you're interested in. You've got the chance for people to come and visit your institution, which obviously may never actually travel physically to see it.
The Google Art project is an amazing, amazing project with Street View technology inside some key collections and museums around the world, the ability to really zoom in on particular items through using their gigapixel technology, and also the idea around the impact that it's having on art history and some of the ways in which new relationships are being formed across collections internationally. We've been talking to some curators who've found some amazing new ways in which to explore collections using technology like that.
And also the other thing is the Google's ability to help us reach a much bigger audience, because if they put something on the homepage of India, it's an incredible reach that they have. And the final example there, the VIP art fair, the fact that you can go to an art fair again without necessarily being there. So if you've got this content online, what does it mean in terms of how we search and find it? So.
Yeah, there's sort of three big models developing now. One is the algorithm-based approach. So how do we search the world's art through algorithms? It's kind of the classic Google approach. But there's new entrants like Artsy in the States, and quite a few others that are moving into this space, trying to create the kind of the DNA of art in order to understand how different artworks around the world can be interconnected.
What Artsy do is they analyse about 40 qualities of an image. So if you're looking at a landscape, for example, it will kind of work out the components and then try and sort of send you to something kind of similar. So it's obviously just trying to create relationships between images in the same way that something like Last M or Pandora does with music.
The second sort of model is the one that Culture Label uses, which is that curation. So we're relying on expert curators, which in our case is the galleries themselves or the institutions themselves, as well as Culture Label as a curator brand. So really using that human expertise to pick and choose the very best from a range, in our case, product, or in other cases, how do you start to navigate collections or particular parts of a collection through the human expertise. And that could really tie into some of the expertise and networks that we have as organisations. And this third area, the idea of community-driven search and discovery, something like Saatchi Online or Redbubble, where they're really growing their audience by allowing people to upload their own profiles, but then engage with user-generated reviews, ratings, and responses to those profiles, so that the best kind of bubbles up through the community. A very different way of approaching it. But it's quite an interesting alternative model in terms of how we start to get the best out of our collections and the best out of our own content.
And obviously for an artist to reach a huge audience, and again it is something like that kind of iTunes effect, and it's very commercially viable as well. So something like Threadless, where they do t-shirts, people familiar with Threadless, a company in the States? Again, it's throwing it out to the crowd to say, okay, I could put my t-shirt design in tomorrow, probably pretty rubbish, nobody would buy it, but obviously the entry point is really, really low to these things. And then in terms of how we receive that content, again, this is really interesting because obviously it's changing, very, very rapidly. So you've got the fact that smart TVs, and I think this is particularly relevant in Australia in terms of obviously the growth of the national broadband network. So in the UK, we found that without having kind of data caps and a sort of slightly faster, obviously, broadband speed at the moment, what that's meant is companies like Netflix came over in the last few months, Amazon set up Love Film. You know, you can get any box set you want, any Hollywood movie, straight through your TV now or through your Xbox or your PlayStation 3. So it's really obviously putting some of those conventional subscription models like sort of Sky and things kind of under a lot of pressure because it's changing so quickly. But if that's the kind of Hollywood end, what that means for obviously niche content providers, and particularly some of the cultural content, is there's a whole range of new ways that we can get our content to people. And it's already starting to happen. So, for example, digitaltheatre.com is going in and filming productions at places like the National Theatre or the Royal Shakespeare Company. Those productions are now able to be watched online through your kind of iPad or through your computer, all over the world. Or, you know, recently Curzon On Demand has launched. Curzon's a chain of art house cinemas, particularly throughout the kind of the London area, and you can access their latest releases that are still showing in the cinema or their extensive back catalogue, again through your iPad.
The opportunities for revenue generation within that, so the overlaying merchandise around the experience or the ability to get people to then connect with the brand in different ways. How do we take the consumer journey from the entry point of your digital TV through to engaging with the brand in a much more meaningful or a longer term perspective?
Okay, and then what does that mean for the organisations that are producing this content? And I think the Royal Opera House is an interesting example here. So they've done a number of kind of, you know, potentially quite controversial things if you looked at it a few years ago. So they purchased a company called Opus Arte, who, you know, this is a not-for-profit organisation purchasing a commercial player. So they were the people that were producing the CDs and the opera and classical music DVDs, so effectively bringing their means of production in-house. Their director's got quite a lot of experience with a kind of broadcast background in terms of shifting how the Opera House thinks about itself to say, okay, what is our website? You know, it's a broadcast platform. How do we also look at how we create kind of multiple layers through which obviously our content reaches audiences? So they're doing things like 3D operas or taking things into the cinema in the same way as the National Theatre Live programme. And then also you've got the point at which how do we approach creating the content? So Film 4 has been very interesting in creating the Film 4.0 platform. Actually, a story can be created whether it's kind of offline going onto online, but how do we think about our content and think about it in multiple kind of platforms from the actual inception point? And then if you look on the V&A site, they've just introduced the V&A channel. Likewise, Bloomberg and Tate have worked together to create Bloomberg shots. The way in which we're using our websites is changing hugely. And obviously the devices through which we're receiving that content is changing as well. And then, of course, you're getting the creation of specific content for online. So the BBC and the Arts Council have just linked up to launch the space, which is all about digital experimentation. What is the content that we're going to create that will go through these channels? And then the next thing is, you know, we've talked about obviously big organisation in terms of the Royal Opera House, but, you know, we heard a lot about the kind of long tail economy over the last few years. And what's fascinating is it's really hard to predict where the hits are going to come from. The image in the backgrounds of Heathrow Terminal 5, not known for its art content on the whole, and this is a piece of work, a kinetic sculpture produced by the art collective Troika. And to date, it's had about just over 600,000 views on YouTube, which is incredible. But I think what's also interesting is then if you get a hit like that, and obviously a lot of this is just about quality content, and the arts world's kind of full of that, is because of the social nature of the world now, with the Pinterest, the Facebooks, once people start sharing that, you know, effectively it's doing your marketing for you. It's totally reinventing the way we think about how we spend our marketing budgets. So 30% of people watching a video are likely to share it. You know, 7 videos been tweeted a day. You know, these are the people, like these platforms are doing our marketing for us, which is really, really exciting. And then you have, you know, things like, you know, where it's executed incredibly well with the right technology partner, you can reach huge audiences. So the YouTube Symphony Orchestra, which I'm sure people are very familiar with in this room because the launch of the most recent project was in Sydney, 33 million people saw that. You know, that was the biggest live event on the internet. More people than saw U2 live in concert through the internet. So, you know, something which you wouldn't necessarily say, okay, that's a smash hit. Actually, executing the right way can reach a really big audience. The final one is just check it out maybe when you go home. Tate have done this fantastic cinematic trailer to their Apocalypse exhibition, which is just great.
And the ability to then monetize social and the huge growth in virtual products, we've seen the huge amount of spending on these virtual worlds and social gaming experiences, whether it's in-game or whether it's paying to access those environments. So the sale of virtual gifts and goods now exceeds $3 billion, which is more than that's sold on popcorn and sort of ancillary sales at cinemas in the US. It's an incredible amount of money that people are now buying on purchasing in-game goods and services, and it creates a phenomenal opportunity for cultural organisations whose very business model is around creating new content or new products or new art.
So you've got things like PlayMob, which is a VC-backed company, venture capital-backed company, which is creating objects which, when they're sold in these worlds, provide a revenue for charities. So rather than just buying your kind of bog standard vase, you can buy something which is kind of interesting and helps somebody like Oxfam. So it creates interesting opportunities for cultural players to do the same things.
Now, one of the interesting things that we've been witnessing in sort of e-commerce moving into the offline space is this huge growth of online influencing offline, and a lot of online players and a lot of online e-commerce companies are now looking at how they can more get a slice of the high street pie. So eBay is one of the most recent companies to do this, where they've just launched X-commerce to explore how they can take the very best technology from the online space, so things like peer reviews, recommendations, all the stuff you'd expect on your online experience, the personalised experience, how they can take that into the high street experience. So when you walk through a door of a shop, how do you get the personalised experience, the right recommendations technology, and the right sort of engagement with that brand? We've done a small-scale version of that with some of the organisations we've been working with, and introduced touchscreen technology into quite a few of the galleries, such as Saatchi Gallery and others, and the Barbican and others, where it's about purchasing in gallery through the own art scheme, where you're able to buy interest-free over 10 months, but also this idea of really being able to browse the full collection and seeing what other products and artworks those organisations are selling. So really starting to connect that online experience, the offline experience, and starting to explore things like how input from those organisations occurs. So whether that's Google Goggles, where you're able to scan a part of an artwork and it'll instantly be recognised through Google technology, that then creates an entry point for a whole range of content to be fed to that mobile device. The Getty Museum's a good example of that, where they're using that technology in the space so you can identify any of the artworks. Or similarly, QR codes, which I'm sure you're all familiar with the Woolworths ads around town, where you can buy your shopping on your way home using the QR code technology. How can we apply some of that thinking, not just in terms of the cultural experience within organisations in the cultural sector, but also as new revenue generators? How can we start to sell products in confined spaces potentially, or how can we start to use QR technology in order to get people engaged on a slightly different level or at slightly different places with cultural activity?
Tesco introduced that technology in South Korea, and it's because they were so busy, apparently they didn't have time to shop, which is quite a scary thought. And then the final one just at the bottom there is obviously thinking about how those devices are obviously in the hands of our consumers that are next to our galleries all of the time. So Foursquare, it's kind of lost a bit of its kind of lustre now, obviously, because everybody talks about Facebook check-in. But MoMA and the Met have both got close to 100,000 members on Foursquare. So that allows them to kind of target people when they check in at the galleries. They can offer them a 10% discount on coffee or a 10% discount on a piece of merchandise in the shop. And because they've got those people as members and effectively they're acquiring kind of lifetime customers, they can start to work out and budget what they're worth. So you quite often now go onto websites and you'll get offered £5 if you sign up, but £10 if you sign up 20 friends. And the idea is businesses are obviously calculating what you're worth to them as a customer in terms of acquiring, so they can build their business model around you. So it's quite a different way to think about how you interact with your customers as a cultural organisation. And then the other thing is taking technologies that are now quite established in other verticals and then pulling them into our world. So, you know, we're all very used to now printing out our tickets at home to use on airlines. And actually, a couple of years ago now, we introduced the technology for the first time in the UK into a cultural environment. So with the Courtauld show, you know, allowed a customer to buy the ticket at home or on their phone, and then they just got their phone scanned at the door. But what was perhaps more interesting alongside the kind of convenience and, you know, taking out the need to kind of post tickets and things like that was the opportunity to start integrating systems. So there was the kind of the add-on sale. So again, they're able to say, well, if somebody buys a catalogue at the same time, we can offer them a kind of 10% discount to incentivize those sales. Customer just picks it up when they arrive at the door. And you start obviously getting a lot of data about those customers as well. Likewise, I think once you start then adding in things like near-field technology, you've got the ability to say, well, how does that technology of the kind of wallet effectively is your phone, how do you take that into the shop, into the cafe in exactly the same way?
One example of that that we've got on another side is the idea of the Museum of London, which is selling memberships through near-field technology. The ability, it's a partnership with Nokia, and the ability to just touch your phone on particular touch points throughout the museum, and you're able to become a member just by using that technology. Those kind of really easy triggers to get people to part with their cash in order to support the museum are really, really effective trigger mechanisms.
It's a very easy way to spend money, the kind of micro purchase. But I guess it is the basis of why businesses like Amazon and Apple are so powerful, because they own the access to our credit cards. They make it easy to buy. So if your phone becomes that credit card, it's quite a scary thought as well, isn't it? And then the other one, which is a trend which culture, I think, can really tap into, is just the huge growth in gaming. And that's happening in two areas. So you've got what they call a AAA title. So in kind of UK terms, that's the kind of £40 Call of Duty type title at the top there, which reached $1 billion quicker than Avatar, which shows you just how big that business has become. Or then you've got the kind of the social gaming element, which is powered by Facebook, and we mentioned, the whole kind of currency around virtual goods earlier. And then there's stuff which is relevant to kind of particular audience segments. So Moshi Monsters is a huge success in the UK, which is this virtual world for kids. 60 million users, 70% of UK children are using that platform. That's where our audience is. That's what we're trying to tap into. And then you've got this massive market around kind of casual gaming, the kind of Angry Birds generation, where it's making it very easy for us to spend small amounts of money to do these things on the train, on the bus, hopefully not in your car. And then what that means for cultural institutions, they're starting to kind of tap into that audience. So you've got examples like Tate Trumps. And I realised that Trumps hasn't really made it to Australia earlier when I was talking about this example. But it's about kind of, it's an old-fashioned card game where, you might have a whole load of cards about cars. And, if Simon had a card and I had a card, whoever had the biggest engine quality might have won. Now, Tate have used the mobile phone to apply that to their artwork. So the artworks have got qualities, and you can play a game by going around a gallery, turning the entire gallery into a big game for young people. And obviously the intention is, as they go around comparing qualities of artworks, they're obviously acquiring that knowledge. Or the Royal Opera House creating a game around the back end of the building, the behind the scenes. So how do you complete challenges in order to kind of get the show on the road? So quite interesting ways of engaging customers through gamification.
One of the core models that we apply as Culture Label, and quite a lot of the organisations we were working with do, is the idea of urbanomics and really focusing in on city-level marketing, really understanding the urban consumer as a very different breed, a very different demographic to other audiences. And the ability for the rise of cities and the growth of cities to enable different types of cultural experience, where the urban customers tend to be more daring, tend to be more liberal, more tolerant, more experienced, more prone to trying out new experiences and services. So if we're able to target products and services specifically to that type of consumer within an urban environment, there's a whole range of different things, and some of them we'll go into in the presentation. We've grown Culture Label on the back of this urban consumer, and looking at some similar sort of urban consumer demographics internationally is a great model where we're creating those connections between different creative cities internationally in order to exchange and create that import-export model around the world for great cultural product and art.
The example there, just if you get a chance to go to the Highline Park in New York City, which has just become a phenomenon. It's a kind of urban park based on a Highline disused railway line, and the art program takes place throughout that space. And because the park's caught the popular imagination of the population there, obviously the arts offer is kind of totally integrated within that. The other side of it, and again, particularly where obviously there's a lot of kind of building and development taking place, is looking at these kind of alternative sources of incomes, but also the trends around kind of placemaking. So in the UK, and it's kind of less so now, obviously, as the financial crisis has kind of bitten, but when there was an awful lot of development going on, there was this whole thing about kind of percentage for art. So there was two ways of approaching this. This is where governments effectively were kind of taxing developers and saying, well, if you're going to build this thing, then, add on some public art. But what was really interesting was developers were being persuaded to build in culture from the outset because it added something to those spaces, and there was a commercial value to that as well as a cultural value. So, for example, the image there is of Kinetica, which is the world's first museum of kinetic art, which was a 2-year temporary installation at the Spitalfields market as part of the huge regeneration of that space. And it was all because the developer bought into the idea of what is the market of the 21st century. Yes, it was about food. Yes, it was about retail, but it was about culture. It was about performance. It was about bringing people together. So they funded that infrastructure without any requirement from the, the sort of the public sort of purse kind of prodding them. And likewise, when we talked about urban consumers, I think the whole secret cinema phenomenon, which has really sort of swept the UK, is a really great example about how new businesses are emerging that are kind of not for profit, but are able to kind of fund their core work. So the general premise behind secret cinema is to take on the kind of multiplex and just reinvent it by actually taking the film into different locations and just creating this theatrical experience around it. So the image there is of Alexandra Palace, and over a month, every single night, thousands of people turned up as they turned this palace into the kind of world of Lawrence of Arabia, and the kind of films in the middle. Now, the whole thing was interesting because it was organised by a not-for-profit organisation called Future Shorts, and their mission is to engage people with quality short film. And the way they do that is by funding their core activity through these obviously quite commercial screenings of films. And it's just a great, great idea. And it spreads entirely by word of mouth. So because people think it's so fantastic, they tell their friends through Facebook. And these guys don't need to do any conventional marketing. They've just created a great product which is connecting with consumers. And I think that's really interesting. So actually, you can start very small, and they did start very small. Now this is a craze that's kind of sweeping the world. Likewise, the creativity around just finding those kind of unused spaces and then just coming up with a great idea. So one of the examples is this is a disused multi-storey car park in Peckham. And it's been turned into a giant outdoor sculpture park by a really creative gallerist called Hannah Barry. It's all sponsored by Campari. And on the different levels, it's no longer used for cars. You've got the sculpture at the top level. There's a kind of bar and restaurant with some of the best views over London. And people come to that area now from all around the city because somebody's just had a great idea about how to use the space differently. And it's obviously funded through a combination of art sales, but also these commercial partners like Campari.
So we're also seeing the growth, as I'm sure you are, of out-of-hours culture and really using cultural spaces in different ways to target the evening economy or to target different types of customer demographic. So it's things from sleepovers at the Natural History Museum through to a great aggregated campaign called Lates across London venues, which was such a great sort of targeting. It ended up being sponsored by brands like Apple and Sony, which are the type of brands that you wouldn't necessarily associate with art sponsorship, but they saw a great opportunity to engage with the demographics that they were targeting through the idea of late night sort of DJ events or using the gallery spaces in different ways, highlighted different parts of the collection for this kind of 25, 35-year-old demographic. Now,
the audience of this was kind of out the door and down the street, and what's fascinating is you know, in a world where it's social, you can lose control of your brand a little bit, and one of the reasons why it was such a fantastic success, because on Facebook the word was spreading that get down to the Natural History Museum because, you know, you're going to meet a more intelligent type of guy there. So these things are kind of, you know, they spread in kind of interesting ways.
One of the other interesting things is the huge growth in pop-up ice rinks across London. We seem to have hundreds of them every year now, but there's so much demand for them that they just managed to maintain year on year, to the point where the ones at Somerset House have been, last year, were sponsored by Tiffany, and just the brand association was great for Tiffany in getting a kind of a real sort of meeting place in that city around Christmas time. And it's those very basic ideas which may be of interest to sort of foreign exports as well.
There was, a few years ago, there was just one, and you know, actually it was some public funding and a combination of the Claw Foundation, the Trusted Foundation that got it off the ground. There's now more than 10 at cultural institutions, so it shows you obviously how you can grow these markets.
So we're going to move on now to look at some trends that we think are directly relevant to some of the assets that we have as cultural organisations. Some of the things that really stand out as the ones that we can jump straight into. So the first one is the idea of storification. And with the amount of content and backstories to cultural organisations and product, it becomes a really interesting trend to capitalise on. So we're seeing over the we believe over the next decade or two, the growth of purpose-driven business or the growth of responsible capitalism, where people are interested in what's also driving companies or what's also driving organisations above and beyond the profit motive. So if there's a story to be told, or if there's a reason for existence that's over and above money, then this is the kind of stuff that we believe will be really defining how capitalism evolves over the next sort of 10, 20 years. So cultural organisations and a lot of the partners that we have on Culture Label are all retailing the idea of product with soul. Every single product has got a backstory. Every single product is artist designed or has something unique, special to tell. So how can we create the right environment, the right online experience, the right offline experience to tell those stories, both around the organisations that have got unique organisational histories, but also and philosophies, but also the story of the products individually.
So if you take the notion, you believe the notion that actually culture is something which a lot of people are interested in now, then actually once you start to build those brands, you can do kind of interesting things with them. So I like the fact that the Victoria and Albert Museum, which over the last 5 years has increasingly become known as the kind of the V&A and has done a lot of work in kind of building its brand, is now finding new ways that can extend outwards. So for example, there's a really kind of clever concept which is kind of around the notion of books and booze, which is a V&A wine bar on the high street. So it combines a kind of high-end art bookstore, which is very much about obviously getting across the messages and the vision of the V&A, alongside a wine bar, which is providing obviously a kind of commercial revenue return. But it's taking the museum out into spaces where customers are and obviously encounter it in a slightly different way.
And this is all being driven by passion brands, the idea that I really want to engage with your cultural brand in new and different ways that really interweave with my everyday lifestyle. How can we take the brands of organisations and find new ways of extending them through things like product or experiences or the kind of organisations, events that we're seeing through this? And particularly in things like retail, we're seeing the idea of using products or events or experiences of ways of extending the brand and giving a better and new way of engaging with that audience and engaging with that organisation, a little bit of the cultural organisation to take home with you.
And then this slide really is about, again, as we talked about earlier, how sponsorship is evolving into something else. And we're very interested in this notion of sort of cultural branding, and particularly the where it's coming from, this kind of co-production idea. So when we talked about Skype and the idea of meeting kind of cultural creators on their terms. And there was an interesting project a couple of years ago, the Sony PlayStation series, which I like because of the way that Sony approached it. And I remember talking to both them and their creative agency. They were really keen, and this was about the time they were trying to get the kind of the PlayStation into, sort of front rooms, into sitting rooms, and really wanting to connect with a family audience, and they thought the cultural sector was the way to do this. And actually they invited the organisations, people like the V&A, the English National Opera, the Baltic, which is a regional gallery in the UK, into the organisation to really get to kind of play with some of Sony's technology, to understand actually some of their problems and their business challenges, to really get to know the organisation inside out, and likewise for Sony to do the same thing with those organisations, and then the ideas and the projects started to emerge. And they've really taken that forward. So most recently, a couple of months ago, with Punch Drunk, which is an immersive theatre company who, a bit like Secret Cinema, just perform theatre in incredible kind of warehouse locations paid for by property developers, actually transformed the underneath of London Bridge Station into this immersive environment for the launch of one of Sony PlayStation's games, Resistance 3.
So one of the things, particularly in the retail space, that we're seeing is this growth of individual artists and the brands associated with individual artists. And so recently we've seen DamienHirst.com launching, and Damien Hirst is the obvious example in this space. He's also got other criteria as a sort of a broader extension of his brand. But we're also seeing it with artists like Tracy Emin, who's just launched Emin International at Spitalfields. And then at a different sort of scale, people like Rob Ryan and incredible opportunities around Ryantown, Zaha Hadid and the Design Museum. We're starting to see some really interesting collaborations with artists that have a unique brand in their own right and different organisations and corporates. An extension of that is this idea of everything being a limited edition, and products and art all really seeing a huge consumer demand for limited edition products and art, and culture, art being the X factor within that edition. So the idea of creating scarcity through the fact that there's only 20 or 50 or 100 of these things available. Now the interesting thing for us is how we extend that into experiences and how we start to look at some ticketed events or some behind the scenes opportunities as new ways in which we can package up experiential products, particularly for the gifting market. So instead of just having to buy a membership or quite a standard sort of gift for others, how can we create some really interesting experiences, tapping into the work we're already doing in our members' offers in order to create new products and services for people to give to each other in a very mainstream way.
And it's extending onto the high street, so with brands like Paul Smith and Urban Outfitters are starting to sell limited editions. IKEA even sold some limited editions, so they're obviously kind of listening too. And then I think also how maybe that sort of works in other verticals as well. So we worked with Amnesty International a few months ago. It's their 50th anniversary this year. And they were really keen to do something a little bit different. So as part of the London Olympics, there's a shopping mall made out of 150 shipping containers, which has opened up. And we've created a kind of concept store with Amnesty International, which is partly around the notion of actually creating these kind of limited edition products with soul, and recognizing that actually they've got people that are incredibly passionate about what they do. They've got a series of different campaigns. So creating products around some of those campaigns, recognizing that people are very happy to pay a premium for Amnesty products because they know they're supporting the organization. So a step away from that kind of classic charity shop model, which is incredibly successful, but saying within this kind of space, which was really about them, you know, sort of positioning themselves with a one-off store, one only, it was a slightly different way of doing it. And then the other trend, which is interesting, where obviously you've got a very creative sector, is our ability to create things digitally. I think it's fascinating. There's a new business called Sedition.com, which is actually trying to sell the idea of digital art. So you can actually download your Tracy Emin or your Damien Hirst digital artwork. And again, there's a limited number. It's kind of locked in a vault. It appears on your mobile phone, on your iPad, and actually is generating revenue for both, obviously, big-name artists and also artists that are perhaps less well-known. The use of David Hockney working with the iPad to create his recent exhibition at the Royal Academy is another good example. Or Beck's working with a whole range of objects to turn London into an art gallery through augmented reality as part of their Green Box project. So you could hold your phone up to a particular area and see an artwork which obviously existed only digitally. And then BMW and Tate have just announced Performance Room, a specific area paid for by BMW on the Tate site, exclusively for digital content.
And around augmented reality, it's suddenly starting to make sense now that we're seeing technology evolving, like Google Vision, where you wear the glasses and things are sort of come at you as you walk down the street. Suddenly it's not about the device and kind of interesting experiences, but kind of pointless. It's actually augmenting your experience and really giving you a reason. So what are the cultural interjections into people's lifestyles that we can use AR technology for? So we like these slides. It's been a kind of a counterculture type role for cultural organisations with these. But we've seen here on the slides, we've got a whole range of different companies and organisations that have been really driving these 15 years of digitisation across a whole range of different areas, whether it's blogging or social or video or a whole range of different things that's going on in the digital space. But after 15 years, we're seeing thought leaders returning to physical experiences, the importance of real stories and the importance of reality and authenticity. And we're seeing this idea of live being big business. How do we connect back with reality? We don't want to live in that digital universe where everything's online. How do we create real experiences and use cultural authenticity as the heart of that kind of wave? Still very much about quality, integrity and context. And heritage being so cool again. We're seeing a lot of brands moving into the heritage space from the corporate environment to really trade on their history. Facebook Timeline's been a great opportunity for that, where people can really get back in touch with the heritage of the brand and really tell the story through that timeline technology. And most importantly, the hottest coffee shop in New York City looks like it would have done 100 years ago. People are wanting those natural human connections, and the cultural sector has got to be one of the ways in which it can supply that demand. Brand stories today, not about global attitude, but local heritage. And this is something we're very, very familiar with Culture Label. How can we ensure that it's not a homogenous thing that's kind of a global sort of homogeneity?
A global supermarket of culture.
Yeah. How can we ensure that whilst we have the benefits of globalisation, we retain a lot of local identity, and what makes us unique on the local scale can then be reflected internationally?
Okay, so we're just moving now into the last couple of slides, really. And, you know, we've talked a bit about, obviously, some of these trends. And I think what's interesting is the way some of this activity is being financed as well. So you've got organisations, this is Cockpit Arts in London, so this is a kind of incubation space for designer makers. Obviously those are all around the world. What they did, which was really interesting, was to say, well, okay, so we get rent from the people that sort of use our spaces. Obviously they use our spaces to grow their business, but what if we really help them to grow their business by actually trying to find finance for them to kind of extend what they do? And they went to quite an unusual place. They went to a venture capital fund because they were able to prove that actually they were really good at growing these businesses, and the return rate where they were able to get hold of money was really good. It was actually much better than a lot of kind of commercial loan return rates, repayment rates. So they were able to actually borrow the money from quite an unusual source, which is now giving them a sustainable form of income to grow those businesses. And we're seeing that online in exactly the same way. So social loans that are being given through the online sort of social entrepreneurs type sites have got a really high level of repayment, much better than actually what lots of businesses are able to repay. So Kiva's a good example if you want to check that out. And then the other one at the bottom there is around this notion of venture philanthropy. So I talked at the very beginning about how Culture Label was a beneficiary of this. People saying, actually, there are some great commercial ideas as well as cultural ideas within the sector. So money's available to grow these sorts of businesses.
And some of the questions we touch on in the book are these ideas of spin-out companies. How can we learn from the university sector to create the atmosphere for innovation within cultural organisations so that if there is a great commercial opportunity to trade on some of the content we have as organisations, what's the strategy around JVs or the strategy around employee ownership that we have as organisations? What opportunities are there for us to spin out a company that can trade on our assets and really pay that money back into the organisation that it's spun out of, but ultimately have the flexibility to be run as a commercial operator? And some of those new models are sort of central to how we create the ownership of decisions and the financial trail in order to let innovation flourish.
So Triodos is interesting there. It's an ethical bank based headquartered in Europe and Holland, and it will lend money for commercial elements of cultural organisations because kind of that's what it's doing in the rest of its world. The other one in terms of this notion of kind of hits versus the niche market is really interesting. I don't know if people are familiar with Faber and Faber. It's absolutely not what you'd associate with a kind of technology publisher. It's, it's a slightly kind of traditional heritage publisher, and it worked with a company called TouchPress, who produced the app Wonders of the Universe, which was used in all the original kind of iPad advertising. Most recently, they've done Elements. They've helped Bjork produce the first kind of iPad app album. And they worked with Faber and Faber in quite an interesting way, and they chose quite a challenging piece, actually, working with T.S. Eliot's A Wasteland. Again, a bit like we talked with the YouTube Symphony Orchestra, not an obvious thing if you were going for the very biggest commercial property. And they just produced a really high-quality product on the iPad, this notion of kind of the app book with sort of videos of people interpreting the poem, the notes, just really great presentation. And within 6 weeks, they'd recouped their development costs. It took about a year to produce this particular work. So I think it's a really good lesson around actually if you produce really high-quality stuff, there can be a commercial return as well as a cultural return. And then finally, this notion of kind of what's happening to the library, and we talked about the fact that kind of Kindle is obviously overtaking the kind of the sort of the traditional printed book. We've been doing a really interesting project with the Library of Birmingham, which is a 193 million capital project. It's the largest public library ever undertaken in Europe. And what does the library of the future like? And it's a really, really kind of interesting challenge for us. So working potentially with partners like Amazon to actually co-produce services that resonate obviously with the users that are doing those things in the rest of their time. Or how do you create a sitting room for the living, for the sitting room for the city? The idea in the UK, lots of people, we don't quite have the coffee culture of Australia. People are going to kind of Starbucks and places like that for their free internet to read their books. How do we create a really welcoming space, which is kind of like the ultimate internet cafe, which is bringing people in so we can connect them with other elements of this new library service that we're creating?
And a lot of the questions there are looking at who are our collaborators and competitors today. So people like Google or people like Facebook. If we go to Google for our information, we go to Facebook for our friends, we go to Starbucks or our local cafes for Wi-Fi and to be in the place. What's the role of a public library in that kind of environment? And how can we go back to some of the founding principles of public libraries to understand what they were created for in the first place, whether that still applies, and how we can apply that to today's consumer society? And really starting to do some of those fundamental questions to understand how a public library can evolve to take into account the changing nature of today's consumption.
To give you an idea how much it's changing, Barnes & Noble, the world's biggest bookseller, they're not a bookseller anymore, they're a technology company. And they're trying to kind of play Apple at their own game, create their end-to-end system, even including their own reading device. But what they're doing is capitalizing on their physical space. It's quite often seen as a drawback in obviously an e-commerce world, to create that connection with readers and to get people to use their devices, to the extent of kind of giving them a free cup of coffee if they can show that they've got a book on their Nook and they've bought the device, because again, they're acquiring that customer for a lifetime. Again, using our venues, I love the idea of the South Bank actually saying it's a year-round festival. So this is the South Bank in London, creating a retail and a catering offer, which is bringing people into that space, but having a pop-up offer as well. So we're very fond of our curries now in the UK. It's our national dish. So a kind of pop-up curry house called Dishoom, a vintage festival with a designer, Wayne Hemingway, and it's a kind of permanent festival, which is a really, really nice idea. Or the National Theatre using actually it's a kind of love it or hate it building, Marmite as we'd call it. That's the campaign we have, love it or hate it, kind of the Vegemite of the UK. And using the building as a canvas for, they've got this great scheme where Travelex subsidise £10 tickets to the theatre, and then using their building as a billboard to obviously expose the fact that obviously Travelex is supporting that.
And for the Library of Birmingham, they've got 16 million people walking past their front door every morning, mainly commuters, but how do we engage with that kind of demographic? How do we ensure that the walk-by traffic can utilise the spaces and services that we provide to create a commercial return for the library?
So I'm just going to move into the last couple of slides. So, and the other thing is, in a global world, it's kind of not enough just to create content, which is your own content. I think the V&A is doing some really interesting stuff in creating content for particular markets. So their V&A site for China, for Japan, it's programmed content for those audience rather than just doing what they're doing in the UK in those places. Interestingly, they also have things like online advertising on those sites, so it becomes a revenue generator as well. We've mentioned Nearfield. I'm aware we're probably running out of time, just, are we? Oh, good. We can talk a bit more. That's brilliant. The other notion is obviously getting beyond the walls as well. And we were talking earlier with the library about a really interesting project that the National Gallery have been doing called the Grand Tour. So again, this one's a couple of years old, but I think it's a great idea, and I'm surprised kind of more people haven't sort of looked at it as a model. So they worked with HP a few years ago to digitize their collection. So they had this obviously fantastic digitized asset and obviously worked with a specialist partner to do that. And then they were able to use this in various creative ways. So this image here is one of a number of artworks that were reproduced high quality, put in frames, and then basically distributed all over the West End of London. And the idea was, 4 million people come to the National Gallery each year, so it's a pretty good audience, but tens of millions of people will see them on the streets of London. So you had really interesting juxtapositions of, kind of a Holbein next to a sex shop in Soho. And then what was great for HP was there was a kind of headline in the Evening Standard one day and an image of a guy who had stolen one of these paintings. So for HP it was great, our printing quality is so good that somebody thought it was the real thing. So you get these kind of really interesting spin-offs. Or in, again, how you think about how your companies market. In Red Square, the advertising at HPD was very much about conserving, obviously the treasures of the National Gallery in London.
The National Gallery is a great example where once they digitised the asset, they found a whole range of distribution channels to get those assets into the community. So, for example, the Eurostar terminal in London, you're able to browse through the National Gallery collection, or you can get it on your iPhone app, or you can see it in some of the kind of the Grand Tour type events. So once they've got that digitised asset, it's then the creativity around how they get it in different distribution channels. And
then physically, I love the idea of BMW and the Guggenheim coming together through their lab and actually taking the museum into the city to look at issues that obviously face urban communities. So it becomes that kind of temporary museum space. And probably the best example of that in the UK is a permanent temporary museum called the Museum of Everything. And what happens is they create these incredible spaces and exhibitions with artists like Sir Peter Blake, popping up sometimes in cultural venues like Tate or around something like Frieze, but equally in a space like Selfridges. So it's your kind of permanent temporary museum, and I like the idea of that kind of ever-changing. And Punch Drunk we mentioned earlier, sort of theatre and pubs in partnership with Stella, really, really interesting. So we talked a little bit about near-field communication with Nokia and the Museum of London earlier, so we won't mention that a great deal. I think mobile, obviously, the other thing is we're probably very aware that the world is going mobile now. So In terms of how we think about designing our websites, quite often we talk about the principles of mobile-first design now, because more and more people are obviously accessing our content through mobile devices. Groupon expect 50% of their business to come through mobile devices within the next 2 years, so it's a massive, massive trend.
So how do we apply some of that thinking to our physical spaces? If people are primarily accessing our physical spaces through things like mobile, or indeed in the next 5-10 years through augmented reality, how do we create the physical and user environment that really lends itself to that contextual information or the contextual assets that we have as an organisation, and really starting to apply some of that mobile first thinking to the physical space?
We quite like Streets Museum, which is an app which the Museum of London did. And you can basically wander around the city and it sort of turns it into a museum. So if you're in a particular street, you can use the camera on your phone, and when you sort of put it in front of a particular building, it'll overlay it with almost like a kind of time machine effect of an image from their archive that sort of takes you back to maybe what that place looked like before. In the same way, the History Channel worked with a number of cultural venues. So when you check in on Foursquare, you'll get kind of cultural facts, and you can kind of collect badges and rewards. And then also, again, in terms of how we're actually sort of generating the revenue for this. Are people familiar with kind of Kickstarter, which has just become a huge kind of phenomenon in the US? And I love the idea of kind of Kickstarter. So this is basically using the crowd to fund new ideas, not necessarily cultural ideas, any creative idea. So the image there was one of their earlier projects, which is an iPod mini. And some guy had the idea of sort of turning that into a watch, and they raised about $111,000 to kind of make that happen. But what's happening with Kickstarter now is there's $7 to $8 million a month are being pledged towards these ideas. So this isn't, you know, a loan or an investment in return for equity. This is the crowd saying, yeah, that's a great idea. Actually, I'll put some money into that. And there might be a lot of money. There might be a little bit of money. And the great thing is it normally starts with your network. So if you're a museum or a gallery or a library, obviously you tap into your initial donors to get obviously funding for the idea that you've got on there. But what's great is once it gets scale, the whole crowd can look at the idea and say, yeah, that's a great idea. So you've got projects that are now over $1 million have been raised for individual projects. Two projects have now reached that mark.
And just as earlier we were talking about the expectation to be able to go to a gallery or museum and use my mobile device for the ticketing system, as I would do at an airport, and there's a similar sort of expectation that I should be able to give as a donor through my mobile. So what's the 4-digit code I get when I walk into an institution in order to pledge a £5? What's that kind of technology that we're seeing in lots of other sectors? How do we apply it to the cultural sector in order to make it dead easy to part with my cash?
And it's not just about money. So I think freelancer.com in the States is a great example where it's about the trading of skills. Or you've got examples like with Tate, we used the crowd to find product designs. They were looking to develop 2 products, £10, that kind of London souvenir, or £100, that slightly more kind of premium art souvenir, and actually saying, yeah, loads of people would love to create a product for Tate. There's loads of people with great ideas out there. Let's create a site where people can submit ideas, and then Tate can judge those ideas and turn the best of them into real products and sell them in the gallery. So that's it in terms of our whistle-stop tour. If you are interested, this is the other advert bit, if you're kind of interested in finding out more of this sort of stuff, we're creating 2 whole events around this. One's around kind of mobile culture. So taking the very best mobile companies, like, you know, last year we did this at the O2 or the old Millennium Dome, people like Google, Vodafone, Nokia, actually alongside some really creative people from the cultural sector, looking at where mobile's going, and then kind of workshops with developers to develop apps and things like that. And then the other one, and this is the subject of the tour, is our next book, Remix, which is all around, a bit like some of the things we've been talking around tonight, you know, what are the 10, 20 trends that we need to know about as cultural leaders, and actually making that real by bringing a whole load of interesting speakers on a day, you know, venture capitalists talking about how we fund culture, people from the branding world like Saatchi and Saatchi looking at how we get our messages across. So looking at a whole range of interesting industry experts coming in and debating, you know, where culture's going. So that's it from Culture Label. Hope you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much, Simon and Peter. We've got plenty of time now for questions, and I'm sure you've got lots of ideas from that fantastic presentation with lots of great content there. But just to give you a moment to think of the first few questions, and also I should just mention, if you could wait until the roving microphones reach you before you ask the question, and maybe if we could have the lights up a little, please. So just to get started, I know, Simon, at the start you were talking about some of the different principles of Culture Label, and I think it might have been the third one, where it was kind of just make sure you give it a go, take risks, get out there and, even fail, which perhaps is not, a concept that we're used to in the arts, especially when we're receiving government funding, and if it's a large arts organisation with a big brand and you want to protect that brand. How do you reconcile the two? Perhaps you could start with that.
Well, I think there's one answer, which is the bigger danger is not to experiment and not to try and not to innovate. I think that's a big sort of question mark, particularly over the next sort of 5-10 year horizon, and as public funding becomes more challenging. But however, I think there's a bigger opportunity to connect with the consumer audience by innovating and by creating some of these entrepreneurial strategies. It's about creating that direct connection with customers, and it's about finding the entrepreneurial strategies like beta launches. So the beta launch stuff that we were touching on earlier, if we're able to create a £2,000 project instead of something like that should be a £20,000 project, just create it, get it out into the marketplace, see people's reaction to it, and if it's a winner, then we back it. Or alternatively, if we have this culture of not being afraid to experiment and trial, but also understand the feedback we're getting and respond to that kind of customer feedback in order to continually innovate and get closer to where we can evolve as an organisation.
That's a pretty good answer. I'll go with that.
Some questions from the floor? In the front row.
Hi. I'm really fascinated in the philanthropical part of things, in the way in which it seems like we're almost getting a competitive philanthropical hobby. Yeah. Is there an overarching aggregator or curator of where you can go to almost be competitive philanthropically?
So in terms of where a lot of these projects exist in one place, or?
Yeah, I mean, I know that you can get badges within Kickstarter, you can earn merit points and, get bells and whistles, but are we moving towards a position where we can almost kind of have a website where you go, oh, look, such and such supports this, and this, and did this project and that project? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, there's the kind of dual answer to that. One is taking where communities are already at, so things like Facebook would be the obvious sort of example for that. But then I think there's also a role for the kind of, going back to that slide on curatorial search and discovery versus the kind of the wisdom of the crowd type mentality. So if we're able to create the platforms where it's around the expertise around these are interesting projects to be involved with philanthropically, or these are the interesting organisations that you may not have considered, it's not always that wisdom of the crowd bubbling up mentality that kind of drives which ones you're witnessing. So I think we are going to see the growth of kind of Facebook wisdom of the crowd type platforms, but I think we're also going to see more and more kind of boutique sites where it's about the expertise around who we can fund based on the expertise of real sort of thought leaders and real sort of curators.
I mean, you have got some aggregation platforms and philanthropy like Kickstarter. I mean, it's US only at the moment. I'm not sure what the landscape is in Australia there, but in Europe there are several kind of competitor sites, if you want to call them that are trying to do similar things at varying degrees of success. Interestingly, some of them are getting quite specialist, so there's a number that are just about culture, others more broader in terms of social or charitable causes. So yeah.
Yeah, no, we do have quite a few. We've got 3 starting within the next couple of months. We already have 2 functioning in Australia. But I just wondered if you think there's big money in competitive philanthropy.
Well, I think there's the other sort of angle on this is the benefits of aggregation. And I think it's a massive driver. For us as Culture Label, it becomes the interesting, one of the main reasons for starting it was that as individual organisations, we can create a tiny pinprick on consumer society and the massive noise that we get in that marketplace. Whereas banding together as a group of organisations, we can create a slightly bigger pinprick. It's still absolutely tiny in terms of the niche that we're occupying, but in terms of the noise we can create by working together, by banding together as 600 organisations, we can actually start to get the recognition for the sector and for the stuff we're coming up to. So in terms of aggregating for philanthropy within cultural organisations and within the arts and creative scene more generally, it's got to be a good thing in order to tap into that bigger niche or the bigger marketplace for philanthropic donations. With my previous hat on and looking at some of the growth areas for individual donors, And particularly around the CSR agenda for corporate social responsibility, the arts always had an incredibly difficult time selling their message because people were more naturally inclined to go for environmental issues, health issues, a whole range of other things that we're in competition against. So it makes sense to work together as a sector to aggregate in order to create the message for those bigger mainstream markets.
I think that's really important. There's a kind of generosity in the spirit of collaboration, and I think the Birmingham Library project was a really interesting one. And obviously it's got this huge, iconic new building, which is a real kind of asset. But the network of branch libraries is as important. If you were to think of the libraries a bit like Barnes & Noble, what are all the various touch points that you have? You know, the beachhead might be the fact that the library can get the conversation with a big partner like an Amazon or somebody like that. But actually the opportunity to then provide a kind of footprint, which was the bigger network of libraries, is absolutely huge. So the generosity to kind of create tools and platforms on behalf of public libraries and use the public library brand is as important as any one individual organisation. And I think the aggregation's playing out sometimes where the big guys work with the smaller guys. So Tate have got a fantastic scheme called Tate Plus, where they work with 10 visual arts galleries around the UK, so smaller regional organisations, looking at things like, you know, how can we improve, you know, back of house savings, how can we get our collection out in new ways. So actually saying, okay, there's an awful lot we've got in common with you guys, and actually our strength is your strength. So how can the larger organisations support the smaller ones? Yeah.
I'm interested in, because I work for an organisation that's a cultural organisation, as in Indigenous cultural.
Okay, yeah.
So I would be, and you spoke about place making. So is there an example, because I was looking up there to see, you know, of Indigenous businesses or cultural organisations involved in philanthropy. Can you think of one that you could share with us, please? I'd be interested.
Oh God, that's a tough question for me. I don't have a huge amount of experience of that, actually, but I don't know if other people in the audience might know, in terms of particularly Indigenous examples, because, yeah, I'm not even going to pretend to kind of guess at that, yeah.
But I do think one of the interesting things, like Peter was on ABC last night talking about Brand Australia, and actually what are the unique things that make the Australian sort of international brand, and what are the areas that we can pick up on and really sort of focus in on. And I think the projects around particularly sort of contemporary versus traditional Indigenous art are really starting to create some of those mashups between new artists and existing established artists. There's a great opportunity for helping to brand the country around some of that work and really create new audiences for that work.
And I think a lot of it was, I was talking about creating other layers and the brand of Australia. So, you know, obviously the fact that it's got such a great natural environment. There are all these kind of iconic images, you know, it's particularly focused often around things like the Opera House, but, you know, there are so many obviously different markets out there in terms of tourism and the value of cultural tourism. To say, actually, you know, if you go somewhere like Brisbane, there's obviously this fantastic cultural scene, or Melbourne and the design community, or Sydney as a kind of festival city. There are all these other layers that people are kind of vaguely aware of, but because obviously these other messages are kind of pushed forward. So a variety of marketing, which obviously then helps create the demand on the ground to help these organisations. So there's probably like a number of levels to it.
Yeah, I guess I was just interested in with your experience and your knowledge of the field, were you aware of any? But I guess the answer is no?
Well, not directly, no, okay, but we've only been here a week.
No, not us, but you're in the UK, in your experience, in what you know of in your world, yeah.
In terms of sort of ethnically diverse audiences?
Engaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, something like the Library of Birmingham is a perfect example. I mean, there's a huge ethnic minority population in Birmingham. In Leicester, it's now over 50%. So the characteristics of some of the cities in the UK have kind of fundamentally shifted. So a large part of the work we were doing with Birmingham Library was, you know, really understanding who your audience were and how they were using the library, because often there was quite big gaps in the data there. So, you know, I think there was an assumption that people were coming in to kind of lend books, but when we did the research, you know, it was kind of 3 in 10. So it was a relatively kind of low number, which then makes you think, well, what is everybody else doing? And also, who are all those different types of customers? Because in an incredibly diverse place like Birmingham, people were coming in to use the library for a whole range of reasons. Some people, it was because there was a partnership with the National Health Service and there was a kind of medical centre there, and actually it was more approachable than going into your local doctor or something like that, more convenient because it was in a high street location. Or people just coming in to use kind of the internet because it was Hotmail and because actually they could Skype people from all over the world for free. And, you know, that necessarily was that a good thing? Yeah, well, of course it is, because it's an ability to connect with customers that may not be using other parts of your service, but actually you can then grab them and start signposting them to what else you're doing.
Peter, just to change tack for a moment, I know we've got a lot of people in the audience who are from the performing arts sector. Perhaps you could explain, maybe your top 3 ideas around cultural entrepreneurship or, income generation for the performing arts that you've seen in the UK?
I think on the content side, obviously, it's really interesting. We had the kind of same question earlier at a lunchtime event we did, and I think something like digitaltheatre.com is really interesting because you're going in, you're capturing that content, and then that content is available to go anywhere over the world, and people are quite happy paying, a premium amount for that. I think in the same way as, the Wasteland app, I think it was $9.99 when it was released. It wasn't at that kind of 70p sort of level, which obviously a lot of apps are at.
And I think the interesting thing with digital theatre was the innovation around how performances are captured. So it's not necessarily the distribution channel, it's more the kind of the capture and commodifying the performance. How we then create the right distribution channels with partnerships with players. It's got to be the mainstream players like your Netflix, or we use Curzon On Demand or others. How we take that cultural content to where the audiences are at rather than trying to create the separate distribution channels just for cultural audiences. That becomes the interesting sort of business models of the future.
I think the final one might be something like kind of Punch Drunk, which we alluded to. And this is not for every organisation, but their principle was very much, actually, let's get outside of venues. So their breakthrough performance 4 or 5 years ago actually was entirely private sector funded as well. Came from the fact that a property developer had a huge former Royal Mail warehouse out in a part of London, Wapping, which basically it was going to be knocked down and regenerated, and they wanted to create a cultural buzz around the area. So they invited, at huge cost, basically Punch Drunk to come in and produce a version of Faust. And they transformed these 5, football pitch-sized floors into this incredible world, including kind of bars, there was hotel sets in there was a kind of prison, a cave, this vast kind of complex of sets. And because it was so wonderfully executed, tens of thousands of people, again, came over a 2-month period to see this performance. And it was about just taking this stuff into kind of different spaces. And then obviously now lots of theatre companies are playing around with those ideas in the same way.
And equally, what are the experiential products around performances? Like, how can we create, let's go above and beyond sort of dinner and dining experiences along with theatre productions. How can we create very different sort of value-added products, experiences around the performances in order to engage with customers on a more premium level and charge for those extra value activities? It's a massive growth area for Culture Label. We're engaging with a lot of partners to create the top 100 experience products around the cultural sector to just get that kind of money can't buy experience, and using some of the innovations around how people can pay for that type of experience.
I mean, a lot of things that we take for granted because we work in that sector, obviously for other people are real premium experiences.
On the topic of something like digital theatre, do you think those sorts of websites have the potential to be quite damaging to the industry? And that I know you used as an example the Regent Open Air's production of Into the Woods, which you can download. You can stream for about £7 on digital theatre, download to keep for £10, but something like that production, you couldn't come by a ticket for less than about £60 if you wanted to see it live. I was just wondering how you think that sort of digitisation has the potential to affect the liveness of the industry.
Well, I think, yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I would look at it from the point of view is that again, you've got to be kind of in this space. Every sector is going to experience the same kind of revolution in terms of content. So some people will, possibly prefer to consume that way because they can't get to the venue to see the actual performance. There'll be certain generations, in particular Google Art Project's interesting here, who actually do have a preference. Actually, we would rather engage this way because we're not necessarily comfortable walking around the gallery. So I think the kind of marketing power of a lot of these things, or the audience development power, particularly as there's some things that you can do online which you can't do offline, I don't think it's better. I think it's just different. I think you've got to be in that space to be part of that revolution, because then actually, if you don't kind of follow it, then you suddenly realise, oh, actually, there's all these kind of spin-off benefits that I hadn't kind of calculated on. And I think, not all of the answers are there at the moment, but for me, I think it's a way that people can get to see things that potentially wouldn't get to see them otherwise. How you create the financial model around that is really, really important, clearly, because you don't want to be kind of undercharging. But I think the one thing we've seen in the cultural sector is a huge growth of the live experience. you know, the tendencies, particularly I'm talking from a kind of UK perspective here, obviously have been kind of growing. And I think things like the National Theatre Live is another good example, a different way of doing it. Getting these performances into theatres, into cinemas have been hugely successful because they're reaching audiences that wouldn't go otherwise, or maybe actually can't afford it at that level, which is why the Travel-X £10 tickets have been so successful, because it actually creates a price point at which people can go in, and then actually introduces people that may not otherwise go, you know.
Yeah, the counter trend of live experiences is absolutely critical, and I think part of that goes back to arts marketing and how we're positioning these experiences. And I think there's a lot of innovation that can happen within how we're communicating, particularly theatre experiences, but a whole range of performances. It's not just about a ticket sale; it's about the experience. It's about the whole product package. And that's a kind of a slightly different way of thinking about those evenings out. How would you gift that product of a ticket without just buying someone a theatre ticket? What's the whole product offer around that gifting experience that we can then get a much bigger audience from?
Campbell, you have a question?
Thank you, sir. I understand you're setting up Culture Label Australia, and perhaps two questions came to my mind as a result of that. One, why Australia as opposed to, for example, the United States or Europe? And secondly, what will be different in your views, admittedly after the short journey you've made, but what do you see is going to be different?
Yeah, well, we thought Australia was an interesting opportunity for a variety of reasons. I think, so some of the initial research we did in terms of, at the moment, e-commerce levels, for example, are actually a little bit lower than Europe or the US, in terms of kind of conventional access through computers and things, because obviously the broadband issues. But I think once the national broadband network's in place, which is, you know, not too far away, I think that'll catch up quite quickly. And the reason I think that is because mobile e-commerce levels are actually higher than Europe and the US. So for me, it's going to have this very kind of quick catch-up period. So that makes it kind of interesting. It's a heavily urbanised population. Again, I think if you look at any survey of some of the top attended museums and galleries around the world, there's always a lot of Australian institutions in them. And I think in particular areas, there's some fantastic designers that we already have on the site. So we've got about 30 organisations that have joined Culture Label without us doing any marketing at all, which means I think those organisations are looking to reach a bigger international audience with their products. But also there's some fantastic product that we're seeing. For us, it's first and foremost about the product.
And we're already seeing a big export market for Australian products. We're seeing a lot of people in the UK, the US that are on site, on the Culture Label site, wanting that Australian product. So it's a natural sort of next step for us to sort of really create the supply within the organisations we're working with. And also, in answer to the question around what will be different, one of the main things is to make it a very local site, so really creating the sort of the spirit of the Australian organisations that we want to partner with. One of the biggest achievements in the UK market has been to work in absolute fundamental partnership with the organisations on site. So it's not about us knowing best, it's about us sitting around the table with the key national institutions and saying what is the image that we want to project internationally, what is the content we've got, what is the kind of editorial we can build around this product, what's the kind of stuff that we can do to create the greatest sort of message for the London type audience. Similarly, we want to work in a kind of a deep partnership with the organisations in Australia to create the kind of the ultimate Australian experience for that cultural sector.
Any more questions? No? Oh, okay, we have one up the front from Mel.
I'd just really like to hear a little bit more about the Secret Cinema Future Short project, because that really captured my imagination about an example of providing a special type of experience to a group of consumers and consumers of culture.
Yeah, well, for me, it's, you know, it's probably wrapped up in that thing of the live experience, and there are parallels, you know, definitely with what's happened in the music industry. You know, it's incredibly well executed, and often it's quite mainstream films with the intention, actually, you know, you can do something like Blade Runner, you know, in a warehouse by Canary Wharf and create that world, and obviously that brings in, you know, audiences from all over because they want to experience that spectacle, and the kind of film's sort of somewhere in the middle. But then around that, what they do is kind of populate some of those spaces with the short films, so there are opportunities for people to connect with their core product, but also it's a way of signing up an audience, and they've got a huge online audience for their future shorts and run online film festivals and the like. what's really interesting is just how much it's grown. So you now have kind of commercial enterprises within the productions. So you'll have things like restaurant partnerships where you can actually go along and kind of eat within these worlds that they've kind of created. And again, in a kind of very authentic way. So they did The Third Man recently. So everything was obviously kind of packaged around that particular way. And I think there's something, people just like going to these kind of cool spaces and doing that sort of stuff. So it's, again, it's really hard to kind of execute well, but it's quite a simple idea. And what's fascinating is the numbers are challenging the multiplexers. You know, they are generating massive audiences. It's hugely lucrative. And people are paying quite high prices. So you'll pay kind of £40 a ticket, you know, good or bad, to go see these productions. And the fact that they're not spending that conventional marketing budget because people are engaging with what they're trying to do. So they're now launching sort of secret cinemas around the world, and again, they're doing it quite organically, so they're giving people almost toolkits to say, okay, now go off and do yours. So their most recent initiative, The Other Cinema, is about transforming almost kind of cinema-type spaces into something a bit more interesting, you know.
There's a massive opportunity for merchandise around that, particularly learning from the music industry.
You would say that, Simon.
But if we're replacing sort of CDs with iTunes, a lot of the value add, going back to some of the limited edition stuff, is this idea of the artist design CD cover or the print that comes along with a particular bit of digital music. In a similar way with performance industries, what are the sort of the value add products that we can put alongside that? What's the cross-disciplinary talent that we can invite to create a whole range of products around the experience and then create new merchandise opportunities there?
Yeah, National Theatre doing some cool stuff, looking back at their archive and obviously what they've collected over the years and turning that into a really interesting product.
Great, thank you.
Right, well, I have one final question. What's the name of the coolest coffee shop in New York, so that we know?
You're going to catch it.
Well, actually, I can't even think what the name of it is, actually. I don't even know what the name of it is. It's just a photo we took. We just thought it was really cool. I don't remember the names of coffee shops.
Yeah,
okay.
We'll put it on the email.
Okay, well, we'll follow up with that. As I mentioned before, we have the slides.
Anyway, it's just our view.
Sorry? Oh, okay.
You
It
might
looked
not
pretty
think
cool
it is.
to me. We have the slides from tonight's presentation will be up on the ABAF website next week, and we'll follow up with you about that. So, look, it's been great to hear more about Simon and Peter's work. I know I've enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience did too. Thank you, everyone here and online, for participating in ABAF's Culture Label briefing here at the State Library. And please join me in thanking Simon and Peter.